The delivery ship came down with a soft hiss, settling into the dusty earth of the distant ranch. The air smelled of rich soil and the faint tang of the alien winds that swept across the desolate plains. The rancher, Mark Keller, stood at the edge of his porch, waiting for what he had ordered. He'd been alone for years, managing his sprawling farm in the far reaches of space. It wasn't easy, but it was his life. He preferred it that way. He had placed the order 2 weeks ago. A companion. A woman. An alien woman from a distant planet who would help him manage the estate. The catalog promised beauty, strength, and independence. He imagined her as a graceful, confident partner, someone he could admire and build a future with. The ranch was a lonely place, and Mark had gotten used to working alone, but it had begun to wear on him. He needed someone to share the silence with. As the ship's door opened with a low groan, Mark stood taller, eager to meet the woman who would change his life. The figure that emerged, however, was not at all what he had imagined. A woman, yes, but not the one he expected. She was taller than most humans, with a slender but muscular frame, her skin a soft shade of violet. Her eyes, however, were not the soft purple he had seen in the catalog, but a deep, almost sorrowful blue. There was something tired in her movements, as though she had seen too much, lived too long in the shadow of something she couldn't escape. She stepped down from the ship slowly, her face a mask of stoic reserve, but her posture betrayed an inner turmoil. She wasn't the carefree, confident woman Mark had envisioned, and with her was a child. A small boy, no older than 5, clung to her leg. His eyes were wide with fear, and he looked around the strange new world with uncertainty, not understanding the place he had arrived in. Mark's brow furrowed in confusion. This wasn't what he had ordered. The ship's captain, a burly man with an attitude that was quick to turn sour, grunted as he approached.
"Sorry, buddy,"
he said, scratching his chin.
"There's been a mix-up. This is the woman you ordered, but the company didn't say anything about her bringing her child along."
He paused for a moment, glancing at the woman.
"Name's Zira, from the planet Zarathena."
They say she's a good worker. Just complicated.
Mark didn't know what to say. He had never ordered a child, and certainly not a grieving widow.
He stared at Zira, and she met his gaze briefly, before looking down at her feet, her hand protectively covering the child's. "I don't have time for complications," Mark muttered under his breath, irritation bubbling up in him. But there was something about her, something that held his attention. She wasn't what he had expected, but there was a quiet strength in her presence, even if she wasn't showing it right now. Zira shifted, her shoulders tensing as if she knew Mark's thoughts. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm.
"I didn't ask for this either, but I had no choice. My child comes with me always."
The captain shrugged. "You can't blame the woman. She's had a rough time, they say. Her husband died in the last battle, and now she's left with nothing but memories and a child to take care of." Mark's eyes narrowed, and he could see the sadness in her eyes, the weight of loss she carried in silence. He didn't want to be a charity for her grief, but the longer he stared at her, the more it seemed impossible to turn her away. He was a rancher, not a heartless businessman. "All right," Mark finally said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You're here now."
"I'll take you both in, but this isn't a home for anyone but the workers."
"I expect you to earn your keep?" His words were blunt, but he didn't know how else to say it. He wasn't good at offering pity. He was good at getting things done. Zira nodded, her expression still unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps gratitude, or perhaps resignation. She didn't argue. Her eyes, tired and distant, seemed to tell a story of a life she wished she could forget. The child, Aaron, tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering something in her language. Mark couldn't understand the words, but he could see the protective way she responded, a quiet comfort that spoke volumes about her love for the child. "Thank you," Zira said softly. But Mark could see the pain that lingered behind her words. He didn't know what it was, but something about her unsettled him. He didn't trust it, and he didn't like the idea of taking on someone else's problems. For a moment, the three of them stood in the awkward silence that followed. Then, Mark motioned toward the barn. "Come on then, let's get you settled." He turned on his heel and began walking toward the barn, not looking back to see if they were following. Zira followed silently, the child in tow, her eyes scanning the vast ranch that stretched out before her. She had no choice now. She had been given a new life, and it was here, on this desolate stretch of land, that she would begin again. Mark didn't speak much as they walked toward the barn. The air was hot, the dirt sticking to his boots as he made his way through the fields. He wasn't sure why he was doing this, why he was offering shelter to a woman and child who weren't his responsibility. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was something deeper. A need to fix what was broken in the world. A need to prove that he wasn't the lonely, self-centered man he had become. Whatever it was, it pushed him to keep walking, to keep moving forward. When they reached the barn, Mark turned to Zira. "You'll stay here for now. I don't have much to offer, but it's better than nothing." He opened the door and let them enter, before following them inside. The barn was sparsely furnished, hay bales stacked against the walls, old farming tools scattered around. It wasn't a home, but it was a place to sleep. It was a place to start over. Zira stepped inside, her eyes scanning the space. She didn't say anything, just nodded. Aaron tugged at her hand, looking up at her with wide, hopeful eyes. Zira knelt down to his level, her fingers gently brushing through his hair, offering a quiet smile to comfort him. Mark stood back, watching them both. He wasn't sure what to make of this strange, unexpected situation. But as much as he didn't want to admit it, there was something about the way Zira carried herself, the way she protected her child, that stirred something in him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. "I'll bring you food later," Mark said, his voice breaking the silence. "For now, get some rest. Tomorrow, we'll figure out where to start." Zira didn't respond at first, but when she did, her voice was low and sincere.
"Thank you, Mark. You don't know what this means to us."
Mark didn't know what it meant either, but as he turned and walked out of the barn, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a decision that would change his life forever. The days that followed were quiet, and yet they were far from peaceful. Zira spent most of her time helping Mark with the ranch chores, doing whatever she could to earn her keep. Despite the rough edges of the situation, she showed a quiet grace that made her a more than capable worker. She knew the land, how to tend to crops, repair fences, and care for animals. Her skills were impressive, but her heart seemed distant, and Mark couldn't help but notice the sorrow that clouded her every move. It was early one morning when Mark first saw it, the moment when Zira's past seemed to haunt her. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in warm shades of orange and pink. Mark had been in the barn checking on the cattle when he heard it. The soft sound of Zira's voice, low and almost inaudible. She was speaking to the child, Aaron, her tone tender, but there was a sadness in it, a quiet ache that Mark hadn't heard before. Mark stepped out of the barn quietly, not wanting to intrude, but something about her words made him stop. He leaned against the wooden beam of the barn, watching them from a distance. Zira was kneeling by a small patch of land, her hands gently brushing the dirt as she spoke in a language that Mark couldn't understand.
Aaron sat beside her, his small hands mimicking her motions, trying to help her plant something. Mark couldn't tell what.
"Mother, will they come for us?" Aaron's voice was small, filled with the kind of fear that only a child could have. Mark couldn't hear Zira's response, but he saw her pause, her body stiffening for a moment. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of pain, before she put on a brave face and pulled Aaron into her arms. "We are safe here, little one," Zira whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "No one will find us here.
We start again.
This is our home now. Mark didn't know what to think. He had never asked her about her past. He knew she had come from a planet torn by war, but the details were sparse. She had never offered any more than that. The tragedy in her voice now was something he couldn't ignore. Something had happened to her. Something that had left scars deeper than he could understand. After a while, Zira stood up, brushing the dirt off her hands. She smiled at Aaron, her eyes softening as she spoke to him in a language Mark didn't know. Aaron smiled back, but it was a quiet, tentative smile, as if he was still uncertain whether this new life was real or just another chapter in a story he didn't understand. Mark had seen enough. He turned away from the barn and walked down to the field, his mind racing. Zira's pain was becoming harder to ignore, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he needed to know more. He couldn't keep treating her like just another worker on his ranch. There was something deep within her that demanded attention, something that, if left unchecked, might ruin what fragile peace they had. He went to the house later that evening after dinner. Zira was sitting in the corner of the kitchen, her hands resting in her lap. Aaron was asleep, his small form curled up in a blanket on the floor beside her. The soft glow of the lantern cast a warm light on her face. But there was a shadow in her eyes, something that spoke of long nights spent in grief. Mark hesitated for a moment before sitting down across from her. "Zira," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I think it's time we talk."
Zira looked up, her expression unreadable.
For a moment, the silence between them felt heavy. Then she nodded slowly, her eyes softening. "What is it you wish to know?" she asked, her voice steady. Mark studied her carefully, trying to find the right words. He couldn't just ask her about her past. The pain in her voice told him it was something she wasn't ready to share, but there was more to her than what she had shown him. She was more than just the worker who helped him on the ranch. She was a woman who had lived through something unimaginable. And he couldn't ignore it any longer. "Why did they send you here?" he asked, his voice low. "I mean, I know the company screwed up, but it's not what I expected."
I never ordered a child, and I never expected someone to be carrying this much weight.
Zira's eyes dropped to the table, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. Mark could see that she was fighting to hold back tears, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of her grief.
"You don't have to tell me anything,"
Mark continued, his voice softer now.
"But I can see it."
"You're not here because you wanted to be. You're here because you had no choice."
"I get that.
I need to understand. For both of us." For a long time, Zira didn't say anything. She just sat there, staring down at her hands. The silence stretched on, and Mark wondered if she would ever speak. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked up at him, her eyes tired but determined. "Where I come from, Mark, there is no peace," she said, her voice low and steady. "My people, the Zarathians, have been at war for as long as I can remember. We were soldiers, fighters, and survivors. We lived for the battles, for the honor. But all of that, it was a lie. The war destroyed us. It took everything. My mate, Aaron's father, he was a warrior too. He died in battle just like so many others. I couldn't stay there after that. I couldn't stay and watch our people crumble. So I left. I left with my son, hoping to find a place where we could live in peace." Zira paused, her eyes distant as she recalled the memories. "But peace was something I could never find, not after everything we lost. I had no choice but to leave. And when I found out about the opportunity to come here, I took it. I thought maybe, just maybe, we could have a chance at a new life, a life away from the war, away from the pain. But what I didn't realize was that the war never really leaves you.
It follows you. It's inside you.
And it doesn't matter how far you run. It always catches up." Mark listened in silence, his mind racing as he tried to process what she was saying. The pain in her voice was raw, and he could see the weight of her words in her eyes. He had never imagined what it must have been like for her, to lose everything in such a brutal way. "You're not the first one to run," Mark said softly, his voice carrying a hint of understanding. "I came out here to get away from the world, to forget everything that happened. I thought I could just bury myself in the work. But sometimes, that's not enough." Zira looked up at him, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something. "And what do you do when it's not enough?" she asked quietly. Mark thought for a moment before answering.
You keep going.
"You do what you can to make things right, and you learn to live with the scars, because in the end, that's all you can do." Zira nodded slowly, her gaze shifting to the sleeping child beside her. "I just want to give him a chance. I don't want him to grow up in a world of war and pain. I want him to know peace." Mark didn't know what to say to that. He couldn't promise peace. He couldn't even promise that things would get better. But what he could offer was a place to start. A place where they could try, at least, to heal. "You're not alone," Mark said quietly, his voice firm but gentle. "I don't know what you've been through, but I know this. You don't have to face it alone anymore. You and Aaron. You have a place here. I'll help you both, whatever it takes." Zira looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. She didn't speak, but her quiet nod was enough. For the first time since she arrived, Mark felt that something between them had shifted. There was no more awkwardness, no more distance. He didn't fully understand what she had been through, but he knew that together they might have a chance to rebuild. Whatever scars they carried, they could face them side by side.